So over the past few years, your boy has gotten thick. Now, I'm not talking about downstairs, I'm talking about upstairs. And if you want to get stared up, you got to build up that upper back. And congratulations, because you clicked on the right video. So just to give you a little bit of a layout of the video, we're going to start with some anatomy. Don't get mad at me, that's just how it has to be. If you don't know how things work in that area, and it is a very complex part of the body, well, you're not really going to be able to train it very effectively. It's not going to be any kind of nerd shit. I'm not going to bore you with all kinds of super details that you don't need to know.
You have your ubulus muscle that connects to the upper dorsimus.
But it is going to be useful information on how you should be performing the movements that I will get to a little bit later in the video. And the upper back is sort of a crowded area when it comes to muscularity, but that's kind of what makes it look so cool. Whether you're lean or not lean, there's a lot of density, a lot of thickness, a lot of details in this area that can look really cool when they are significantly developed. All right, so first up we have the traps, upper, middle, lower, and these are responsible for elevation, retraction, and then depression. So instead of going to see a therapist, you can just get your lower trap sorted out, and then boom, you're good to go. Next up we have the rotator cuff.
What we need is a few good taters. What's taters?
There's actually 4 separate muscles which you don't need to know the names of. Teres minor, subscapularis, infraspinatus, supraspinatus. Nailed it. And some of them you can't even see because they're actually not even visible, even if you develop them a lot. But some of them you can see, and I think especially if you do like a back double biceps, these are quite visible, and they can look very impressive, particularly if you are lean. Next up, you have a very underrated muscle, the teres major. I actually consider these to be just as important as the lats, even though they are not quite as big, just because they are located in a place that makes you look not just thicker, but wider as well. Plus, if you look at yourself from the back in a side angle, they kind of stick out and just look fucking awesome. They are not the lat, they are a separate muscle, and I think they should be specifically trained. Fourth, you have the rear delts. Lee Haney, 8-time Mr. Olympia, he called these the jewel of the upper back, I believe. And I think that's a great description. They just tie everything together through the delts and the traps and the lats. Just, you cannot avoid the rear delts. I don't think it's possible to have rear delts that are too big. I've never seen a physique and be like, rear delts are a bit much, but I have seen a lot of people who are lagging and lacking in this area. And so we're going to have some movements for those as well. Number 5, the spinal erectors. I think when a lot of people hear erectors, they giggle, as I do, but they also think that it's the lower back. They think that the erectors just end halfway up the back, which is absolutely not true. And I would say this is actually one of my personally stronger muscle groups. There we go, giggling again. And so we're going to have some exercises in there to train up that area too. I see a lot of people where they have decent lats, decent width, okay delts, but the middle part of their back is just a barren wasteland of nothing. We need to change that. Like in The Lion King, when they go to the forbidden wasteland and it's nothing but elephant bones and deadness. That's your upper back, basically, bro.
What about that shadowy place?
That's beyond our borders. You must never go there, Simba.
I did not include lats in this list. To me, the lats are not really upper back. Some people do include it as such, but it's not lower back. It's sort of between lower and upper, and I think this is sort of beyond the scope of this video, and I don't want to overload you guys with information. So the first exercise is going to be an underhand easy bar Yates row. So why an easy bar? I think this is because if you're totally underhand, it feels like a little bit of an awkward position, and especially when you're bigger, it can be even difficult to get into that position. And I do think that you are potentially at risk for pterygobiceps, and just getting just a little bit of rotation outwards can be much more comfortable and just a little bit less risky. And so that, I think, is the way to go. You can also go overhand. This is going to sort of shift the tension more to the upper back, whereas underhand, you get a little bit more lats, not a great lat movement, and it sort of shifts it to more lower traps. You're going to want to bend over, not a ton, and you're going to want to let your scapula move as you row. That is the biggest issue that I see with rows overall. People who are not actually moving their scapula. They're just moving their upper arm, and they're not allowing that protraction and retraction. That is going to be what actually develops your thickness, because moving your arm and just your arm is really just going to be lats and maybe some rear delts. You can get more out of the movement if you allow yourself to round forward. Now, if you are more of a beginner and you don't have as much postural awareness, you might not want to bend over too much and just maybe do a chest-supported row, either on a T-bar machine or just lying on an inclined bench with dumbbells. But either way, make sure you're getting your shoulder blades forward in order to actually train the back to the fullest possible extent. Maybe you can use more weight if you're only moving your arms, if you're cutting the range of motion, but I don't think you're getting very much out of that for most people. And there's this bro science idea that rows are for thickness and pulls, vertical pulls, pull-ups, pull-downs, etc., are for width. I think there's a grain of truth to that, but it does depend on how you do the movement. If you do your rows driving your elbow down and back, it's almost more like a truncated vertical pull, and you're going to be working more lats. Whereas if you do a vertical pull and you're sort of pulling to your chest and keeping your chest up, it's almost more like a horizontal pull if you look at where the bar is in relation to your chest. So there is a grain of truth here, but you have to look at really what the elbow is doing in relation to your torso, because that is going to dictate what muscles actually get worked. You can also try a Kelso shrug. So normally a shrug is elevation. Basically, this is a shrug in the horizontal plane. So you're shrugging back. So you could either do this as its own movement, just, get on an inclined bench with dumbbells and just start shrugging, getting, again, that full stretch, full contraction. This can actually be good practice if you're used to only pulling with your arms and you're not used to actually protracting and retracting, because it's just a shrug. Your arms are not supposed to bend, and therefore it kind of forces you to use those muscles. You can do this on a cable row as well, but whichever variation you choose, I think that it's important to have some kind of stability, because you're probably going to be able to go heavier on these, and therefore you probably don't want your lower back to be the limiting factor. So if you're doing some kind of super bent over row and then you're trying to retract, it's probably going to be your lower back that is the limiting factor, which is fine if you're trying to train that, but I don't think this is the best way to go about it. Now, exercise selection is important, but either way, you still should be tracking your progress, and that is why this video is sponsored by Boostcamp. It's an app where you can actually log all of your training. Super convenient. You have it with you in the gym. Oh, what did I do last week? Beep, bop, poop. Oh, that's what I did. I'm going to try to do a little bit more. That's called progressive overload, motherfuckers. Yeah, and it works, and it's necessary, and having something at your disposal in order to track that, super vital. You can use code GVS in order to support the channel. I also think you get something free, a week or two of Pro, I think. I should have checked this before filming this section, but now it's like gambling. You don't know, am I going to get a week? Am I going to get 2 weeks? I don't know. I guess you'll find out when you click the link in the bio, as the influencers say, and you enter the code, and then you're like, oh, I hope it's 2 weeks and not 1 week. I don't want to disappoint you, anyone. So anyway, thank you to Boostcamp for sponsoring this video. Next up, and this one should be familiar to anyone who follows my stories on Instagram, we have the THICKENATOR. And this has to be in all caps, and it has to be said that way, the THICKENATOR. And this is going to be basically a rear delt cable fly gone well beyond failure. So start with full range of motion, strict reps, and then as you get those really, really grindy reps, feel free to either bend your elbow a little bit to keep going, or perhaps pulling a little bit more down in order to make it easier, or perhaps you can use a little bit of oomph. Any of these strategies to keep going beyond failure, or perhaps even multiple strategies, as long as you're genuinely beyond failure, I think can be very, very productive. Plus, unlike a lot of rear delt movements, you are actually bringing the arm across the body. So you're actually getting a pretty good stretch on the delt compared to most rows. For example, most rows, you don't really go beyond maybe here. So you have all this range of motion, which can be very, very productive in terms of getting a good stretch, getting more range of motion, and ultimately stimulating more muscle growth. Next up, we have the cable row done in a very specific way. Now, the cable row incredible movement, a wide variety of ways that you can do it to target either your lats or your rear delts or your traps. When I'm trying to target my upper back thickness, I basically pull right to the nips, right up here. If you drive the elbows down, again, you're going to be working more lat. And it's a decent lat movement, especially if you allow yourself to get that stretch. But I find that staying maybe a little bit more upright and just really trying to squeeze that scapula back is incredible for thickness. You can go beyond failure, very, very safe. Lower back is probably not going to be the limiting factor. And these are just absolutely fantastic for developing that area between and around the scapula. Next up, we have the face pull. Now, this is another movement where you can do it in a wide variety of ways. Do you do it Jeff Nippert style, quite a bit heavier? Do you do it Mike Israetel style? Do you do it Jeff Cavalier style, more focused on just the sort of the external rotation, sort of prehab aspect of it? I think you can do all of them. I think you could even do all of them within the same set if you really wanted. Now, you might say, oh, well, this makes it harder to track. Personally, I don't even track my face pulls. I know that's kind of sacrilege, but I just start pulling, man. I just start yanking it, and I just keep going. So sometimes I pulled my eyes, sometimes my forehead, sometimes my chin, sometimes even a little bit lower to where it's almost more of a row. Sometimes I go way high and focus on that external rotation. And I think all of them are totally fine, good movements. You could focus on rear delts, side delts. You could do external rotation. Very versatile movement, and the answer is basically just yes. Next up, we have a few different movements to work the spinal erectors. And I think a lot of this is just going to be personal preference, to be perfectly honest. Any kind of deadlift performed hard for reps is going to work this area. Could be a rack pull from a little bit above the knees, at the knees, below the knees. Could be from the floor, could be a deficit. You could go a little bit more extreme and do like a deficit, snatch grip, stiff-legged, Klokov style, where it really forces you to get in a shitty position and then extend through. And get the shoulders back. Anyone who says that deadlift is, it's just glutes and hamstrings, maybe they're doing it in a way that preferentially targets those areas. If they keep super strict form, braced, everything neutral, and they're just doing like a pure hinge, fair enough, that is going to be a lot of posterior chain because that is where it is being demanded of, because that's what's being used. But if you allow your shoulders to go forward and yourself to hunch forward a little bit, and I do think you can get used to this position as long as you start very, very light and you don't push things too hard too quickly, I think you can get a lot out of this movement. All the guys who I see deadlift with their back have a big fucking back. And so, it's a compound movement. You can use many different areas to accomplish the task. And so if you are specifically doing it in a way that uses the back and you're seeing sort of this rounding and unrounding, as long as you're staying braced, I think this can be extremely effective for the upper back. Also, big shout out to front squats. I think having that weight here in front of you is very, very taxing on that mid and upper back extension. Lower back, to a certain extent, but I think because the bar is so far out here, which is far away from your upper back, I think it's just going to tax that area a lot. I know a lot of people who think that the upper back is a limiting factor. Maybe it is, but that's also a good way to train the upper back. So part quads, part upper back, hell yeah, what's not to love? You also have zerchers, which I don't have a ton of experience with, but again, it's sort of this rounding and unrounding, and so that's going to train your upper back as well. Even if I don't have a ton of experience with it, I can just see what is working. And then also, shout out to the Jefferson curl. Again, with this much rounding, I think it's important to start very, very light and give yourself months and months and months and months to build up. But again, this is going to be working a lot of not just hamstring and lower back, but a good amount of upper back as well. Next up, we have something called skiers. So basically, you take two dumbbells and you either lie down on a bench or you can sort of sit on a bench and hinge forward. As long as your lower back is strong and stable and you're braced and you feel fine, I think that's okay. Maybe start lying on a bench just to get a feel for the movement. And then you essentially just fling the weights back using your rear delt. You can almost see my rear delts in the camera here. And it's not working the lats, okay? If you find yourself pulling with your lats, I think you're doing it wrong. You want to flare your arms out a little bit so that you're isolating as much as possible the rear delts. Now the upper back, the mid traps and upper traps, those are still going to be working quite a bit as well, but it is predominantly a rear delt movement. Now you might say, oh, but you're not getting a full stretch on the rear delt. Well, I'll have a full video on why I don't think being super lengthened is always a good idea. But I still think these have a lot of value, even if it's a more sort of shortened focus movement. That being said, I do think you're going to want to go beyond failure on a lot of these movements because they are most difficult in that contracted position. And so they are basically just ripe for going beyond failure as long as you can safely do so. So if it is a face pull, if it's a skier, if it's a Kelso shrug, if it's pretty much any kind of chest supported row, I think you can and should get to the point, maybe not immediately when you're a beginner, but you should get to the point where you can go beyond failure. And I think that is going to give you significant dividends in your quest for having a thick upper back. Finally, and this one is quite bro sciencey, I'm going to throw in the behind the neck press. Yes, indeed. Specifically with a wider grip. I call it a Klokov press because he kind of popularized it, where you have to sort of keep everything. You have to keep your chest up. You have to keep in a position that a lot of people simply can't get into because, phones, computers. I think if you can get to the point where you can press up here, you will probably notice a difference in your upper back. A lot of people will say, no, it's moving here, front delt only, nothing else works. Have you done the movement? It is absolutely working the upper back as well. And so I think getting at least decently strong full reps on some kind of behind the neck pressing movement is a good idea. Now, any press is going to work the upper back to a certain extent, but I do think being strict and being in this position where you have to stay like this is probably the best of the bunch. You know what? Fuck it. I'm going to throw in another one. Number 9, dumbbell chest supported rear delt fly. Now, this is another one people are going to say, oh, but there's no stretch. I think you need to do it aggressively.
Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.
I think if you're really slow and really controlled, you're going to be using such minuscule weights that I don't think you're going to get very much out of it. You need to be aggressive.
All I know is that first, you've got to get mad.
You really need to be, and work up to this, obviously. If you're moving aggressively, you need to prepare the body, be able to handle that. But you're going to want to sort of really be flinging the weight out of that bottom position. I know this sounds ridiculous or even risky, but once you can get to the point where you're really accelerating the weight out of that bottom position, you'll find that it is not actually the most challenging at the top. It's challenging at the bottom because you're trying to really accelerate the weight as hard as you can. It's hard through the mid-range because you're still trying to accelerate it so you can get the weight as high as possible. And then it's hardest at the top as well because you're trying to squeeze and get it up as high as possible. Then it's also challenging on the way down because there's this massive weight you just sort of tossed up there, and then you're controlling it on the way down, and it's really hard. And then it's really hard at the bottom again. So instead of a movement where you're moving slowly and it's easy, oh, difficult, oh my God, difficult, easy, it's difficult during the whole fucking movement. And if it's difficult the entire time, I don't know. For me, I look at that as being something that's pretty damn good for muscle growth. I think a lot of people who don't get very much out of this, they're simply doing it in a way that ensures that. So there you go. 9 movements. I can't do 9 movements. I just can't. A list of 9 movements, that's unacceptable. All right, 10th, lateral raises. Now, I did a whole video. You can search the channel for this. But I do think having something where you are going all the way, you're taking your scapula to Pound Town, baby. I think this is something that a lot of people either don't do or maybe can't do, but I think it's something that everyone should be able to do. And yes, this is going to work side delts, not so much rear delts, but it is going to work that sort of inner scapula meat right in between the scapula. Again, because you have to get in that upwardly rotated position every single rep. I'm not straightening my arm here because I would smack into the wall, but you should keep your arms fairly straight on this movement. And man, it is a winner in terms of shoulder health, which I think is going to be important long term, and then just working a lot of those sort of smaller details of the upper back. Now, in terms of volume, you can do a shitload of volume for your upper back. Seriously, it is one of the most resilient and tolerant areas of the human body. It really is. So if you're like, I'm at 15 sets, that might be underdoing it, especially if you're like, I keep 2 reps in reserve on my chest supported rows. Well, 15 sets just is not very much for this area. 15 sets for hamstrings, that's a shitload of sets for your hamstrings, especially if it's on hard compound movements like RDLs, back extensions. But considering how many different functions and how many different areas and how a lot of these movements are actually very safe to go beyond failure, I think for most people, you can do a lot, still recover, and still grow. So yeah, don't underestimate your ability to do work with this area. In terms of rep ranges, I would say 8 to 12-ish is a pretty good starting point. Maybe a little bit lower on the deadlifts, front squats, etc. Maybe a little bit higher on some of the stuff like skiers or glute laterals, the isolations. If you're doing your glute laterals for sets of 5, I think that's probably just a little bit too heavy. And so, yeah, I would say most stuff 8 to 12, a little bit higher, maybe 10 to 15 on the isolations. Beyond 15, especially beyond 20, I think it's probably going to be maybe just a little bit too light. If you take maybe a 10 rep max and you do partials all the way to 20, which I've done before, I think that can be very effective. But if it's like a strict set of 20 to only failure, probably just a little bit too light for most people. Anyway, you can check out my books for way more details on proper programming practices. The details, they absolutely do matter, especially once you're into the intermediate stage and beyond. Feedback has been incredible. I'm super happy that you guys like the book so much. And thank you so much for supporting the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.
You've got to get...
Guns, they'll get you.